The world was burning. The Hittite Empire had evaporated. All that remained from its ashes were the forgotten names of gods. Until linguists deciphered that language, we didn't even know who they were. The Minoan palaces had crumbled. The heroes of Homer, along with the civilization itself, had been buried in a 400-year-long darkness. They had forgotten how to read and write. That globalized Bronze Age system, which worked like a Swiss watch, had completely collapsed. Supply was broken, demand ceased, and trust vanished. The storm of the Sea Peoples had ravaged the Mediterranean, and now the eye of that storm was upon the last jewel, the ancient gift of the Nile, the land of the pharaohs, the last bastion of order, May-at, Egypt. If Egypt fell, nothing would remain of the Bronze Age civilization. Literally, the lights would go out, but Egypt didn't fall, because it had perhaps its last great pharaoh, Ramesses III. This is the story of his impossible war. Welcome to the Shard of History. To understand why Egypt was different, we must first understand why, while the Hittites and Mycenaeans collapsed, Egypt was able to resist. The answer is one word: the Nile. But it wasn't just a river. It was an ideology. Egypt had been built on the predictable cycles of the Nile for thousands of years. It flooded at the same time every year, fertilizing the soil. This had encoded stability and unchangeability into Egypt's DNA. Their greatest fear was chaos, their greatest ideal, ma'at, cosmic balance. The Hittites were dependent on imported grain, and the Mycenaeans relied on overseas trade. Egypt, however, was self-sufficient. This was their greatest strength, but perhaps, in the long run, their greatest weakness. As the world changed, Egypt was programmed to resist change. However, this didn't mean the waves of collapse didn't reach Egypt's shores. Trade had stopped. Egypt's beloved Lebanese cedars, vital for ships and temples, Aegean olive oil, and Mycenaean wine were no longer arriving. More importantly, Egypt's buffer states, the Hittites and Mycenaean worlds, had disappeared. The Brotherhood letters no longer arrived. Silence had descended on the palace. Egypt was diplomatically alone. Remember those letters from the last Hittite king, begging Egypt for grain? Egypt knew its neighbors were dying of hunger. They knew the threat was coming, and the threat arrived. From two directions. The first came from the land. From the west, the Libyan deserts. The Lebu and Meshwesh tribes who had always been a thorn in Egypt's side. But this time it was different. They had groups from the Sea Peoples with them. The Shurden, perhaps others. This wasn't just a raiding party. Egyptian records clearly state that this alliance wanted to settle in the fertile lands of the Nile Delta with their families. This was the first wave, repelled by Ramses around 1177 BCE. But this was just the precursor. The real earthquake was coming from the sea. 1175 BCE, the migration fleet. Women, children, ox-drawn carts, and tens of thousands of warriors. As we saw in the previous section, this was not an invasion army but a people uprooted from their homeland. And they had nothing to lose. They weren't just coming to plunder Egypt, they were coming to conquer it. They were looking for a new homeland, and their eyes were set on the Nile Delta. Here's where Ramses III's genius, or perhaps his desperation, came into play. He knew that the Sea Peoples could not be stopped on land. They were like an unstoppable avalanche. They had already crushed Hattusa, Ugarit, and Mycenae. But on the sea, in the narrow, shallow, marshy branches of the Nile, Egypt had an advantage. Egypt traditionally was not a naval power. Its armies were built to fight on land. But Ramses had no choice. He gathered his entire fleet, likely consisting of non-Egyptian Phoenician and Canaanite ships, and army at the mouth of the Nile, in the delta's maze-like river channels. A trap was set. The walls of the Medinet Habu temple give us the first detailed depiction of a naval battle in history. It's an epic work of propaganda, yes. The pharaoh is depicted in enormous size, crushing his enemies single-handedly. But it's also the grim evidence of a brutal battle. The details matter. Egyptian ships were more agile and carried many archers alongside their rowers. Archers were the backbone of the Egyptian army. The Sea People's ships were bulkier, designed to carry soldiers and families, and likely more reliant on sail power. In the narrow, windless channels of the Nile Delta, this was a disadvantage. Ramses's plan was simple. Draw them to the mouth of the Nile, cut off their escape routes with soldiers on the shore, and rain arrows down upon them. The carvings show exactly this: a chaotic jumble of ships tangled together, arrows flying through the air, Sea People's warriors with horned helmets falling into the water, Egyptian soldiers using hooks to pull enemy ships closer, leaping from ship to fight with swords. This wasn't a neat, orderly naval battle like Trafalgar Square. It was a brutal ship slaughterhouse in a river. The result? In Ramses' own words, "I overthrew them, killed them in the borders of my land. Their hearts ceased forever. Egypt had won." The pharaoh had defended Maat, order, against Isfet, chaos. Egypt had survived, but at what cost? This victory was Egypt's last song. It was the last great moment of the new kingdom. Yes, Egypt had defended its territory, but these wars had drained the imperial treasury. The flow of gold from Nubia had slowed. There were no resources left to pay mercenaries or soldiers. Documents from this period mention Egypt's first worker strikes. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina, those sacred artisans who built the pharaoh's tomb in the afterlife, repeatedly went on strike because their wages, grain rations, weren't paid. Notes in the papyri reflect panic. Workers crying out, "We're hungry! We're thirsty! We have no clothes!" This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was an unprecedented sign that the pharaoh's divine authority was being shaken. Moreover, Ramses settled some of the sea peoples he had captured, especially the Philistine and Checker tribes, as mercenaries on Egypt's northeastern border, in the Canaanite lands, near the cities of the Pentapolis in today's Gaza Strip. This seemed like a clever move in the short term. Make your enemy guard your borders. But in the long run, these Philistines would evolve into the powerful enemies that would plague Egypt for centuries. The pharaoh hadn't killed the monster. He had just imprisoned it in his own garden, and perhaps most importantly, this victory isolated Egypt. The entire globalized world around it had vanished. Egypt was now a solitary giant with no one to trade with, to play diplomatic games with, or to form alliances. The pharaohs who followed Ramses, many of whom would take his name but never match his shadow, grew weaker and weaker. The empire shrank. Control of Nubia's gold mines was lost. Worse still, the balance of power within Egypt itself shifted. The priests of Ammon in Thebes grew so wealthy and powerful that they eventually rivaled the pharaoh's authority. The country was effectively split in two, the Third Intermediate Period. The glorious imperial age of the New Kingdom had come to an end. Egypt survived, yes, but it was no longer ancient Egypt. It was like a broken giant. The storm of the Sea Peoples had passed, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. The Hittites were gone. The Mycenaeans had been swallowed by darkness. Egypt had weakened and was now alone. That Swiss watch was completely shattered. So, why did Egypt survive while the others fell? The answer is ironically simple: because Egypt was the least integrated into that global system. While others were dependent on global trade, Egypt was self-sufficient. This was its salvation. But at the same time, this isolation planted the seeds of its future weakness. As the world transitioned into the Iron Age, Egypt was trapped in its Bronze Age past, its perfect but now outdated order, Ma'at. The collapse of the Bronze Age teaches us an unsettling lesson for the modern world. How similar is our globalized world to that world 3,000 years ago? How fragile are our supply chains? How vulnerable are our financial systems? How dangerous is our dependence on the climate? History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and the end of the Bronze Age is one of the loudest, most cautionary echoes. Thank you for subscribing to The Shard of History. This was the final episode of our series on the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. So, how was a new world born from these ashes? How did classical Greece emerge from the Greek Dark Ages? How did the Iron Age begin? Where did the Sea Peoples go? These are the echoes of the future,